Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and it's time for another daily dose of Alchemy spoilers. And today, we got a bunch of red cards, we got some blue cards, we got some really interesting stuff, which probably means we should jump right into it. Start talking sweet new Alchemy cards. Before we do, a couple of quick reminders. One is, if you want to keep up on all the latest spoilers throughout the day, head over to MTGpreviews.com. You can sort them, you can filter them, all that sweet stuff. Number two is, if you need some paper magic cards, you can get them from our awesome sponsor, Card Kingdom, by heading over to cardkingdom.com/MTGGoldfish. You can even get a free MTG Goldfish sticker. Just let them know you want one in your order notes, and they'll hook you up for free. So thank you to Card Kingdom for supporting the show. And let's talk some Alchemy. First up today, we have a few more blue cards, starting with a blue mythic, a pretty interesting card, Aglor, Devoted Assistant. So Aglor, 2-mana 1/1 homunculus. At the beginning of your upkeep, you look at the top two cards of your library, and you can mill one of them. So some amount of card selection, you can get rid of your worst card theoretically, keep your better one on top that you draw for your turn. But then it has this weird ability where when a creature card is put into your graveyard from your library or hand, so not the battlefield, but if you mill it or you discard it, it perpetually gains, when this leaves the graveyard, make a 2/2 tapped zombie creature token. So Aglor, essentially kind of like a Sultai Ascendancy on a body, an old Rusting on a body, these self-mill cards that give you a little bit of selection built in, and then you get this crazy Desecrated Tomb-esque ability where as your cards that you mill or discard leave the graveyard, you're going to start making these 2/2 zombies. They're tapped, so you can't block with them right away, but still, this can offer a lot of value for very little cost once it gets going. So what do you actually do with Aglor? And there's a bunch of fair ways to play this. You can play this as a self-mill card, some sort of like Sultai self-mill deck in the Alchemy format with your Undead Butlers and your Old Stick Fingers and your Eccentric Farmers. So Aglor's just helping you fill your graveyard, and then you probably have some, whatever, Aghanim's Awakening, some sort of reanimation shenanigans that maybe makes a few zombies along the way. So even as just this 2-drop self-mill card that maybe makes some zombies, it's really not bad. It gets crazier though when you really build around it. We got stuff like Skyclave Shade. You mill that, then you cast it from your graveyard, and then you're going to get a 2/2 zombie as a double kicker, essentially. Cobbled Lancer is really sweet because to cast it, you got to exile a card from your graveyard, and that can trigger Aglor, and then you can exile it from your graveyard to draw a card, which would also potentially trigger Aglor if you can get it into your graveyard from your library or hand. You got Even Death, you got Demolish, so these recursive threats can work really well with Aglor. And then, maybe my favorite Alchemy combo, well actually there's a couple Alchemy combos for this, but one of my favorite synergies is Grolnak. Grolnak, the way it's worded, whenever you mill a card, you are able to exile it if it's permanent, but it hits your graveyard briefly. So let's say you got Aglor out and you have Grolnak going, you're milling over creatures, those creatures hit the graveyard for a split second, so they're going to trigger Aglor, and then Grolnak's going to exile them, so you can exile them with a Croak counter, you can even cast them later, but that's going to make a zombie. So essentially any creature you mill with those two on the battlefield is going to give you a 2/2 zombie for free, and you can still cast the permanency exile because of Grolnak's ability. Throw in like a Willowgeist or something, and there's actually potential for a real deck, some sort of Frog, Mill, Aglor, shenanigan deck in Alchemy. And then there's a bunch of other ways. You can get cards in and out of your graveyard. You can reanimate them with Aghanim's Awakening. Disturb cards just naturally leave the graveyard. Blood Fountain, kicking them back to your hand. Aglor doesn't care as long as it's going into your graveyard from your hand or your library. So basically discard or milled. It doesn't care how it leaves the graveyard. But the most interesting part of Aglor is the perpetually aspect of its ability. So we've been mostly talking about relatively fair implications, but let's take a card like Sanitarium Skeleton in Historic, or maybe Bookworm in Standard / Alchemy. These are cards that can potentially be leaving the graveyard multiple times. So here's what I'm imagining. Let's say you got a Sanitarium Skeleton and you got a way to discard it each turn, like Suspicious Stowaway. What you can do is discard your Sanitarium Skeleton. That's going to trigger Aglor, so when it leaves the graveyard, you get a 2/2 zombie. Then you pay 3, return it back to your hand, get that zombie token. The next turn, you discard your Sanitarium Skeleton again. Aglor is going to trigger again, and this ability stacks. So now you have a Sanitarium Skeleton where when it leaves the graveyard, you make 2 zombies, and then the next turn you discard it and get it back again. Now you're making 3 zombies, then 4 zombies. So you can build around this in a way thanks to the perpetually mechanic, where if you have the same card that can keep going back and forth from your graveyard into your hand, from your graveyard to your library like Bookworm, you can just make this an entire deck and build a massive board of zombies. It's kind of an unbeatable late game engine, assuming your opponent doesn't have any graveyard haste. So that's the easiest way to abuse a perpetually mechanic, and maybe the most exciting thing you can do with Aglor. In Historic, I think this also could have potential in some sort of Lurrus shell. So you got Lurrus, you got these cheap self-mill stuff, which already shows up in a Lurrus deck, like Archfiend's Vessel, Stitcher's Supplier. You got Aglor to fill the graveyard, you're milling over creatures, and then, I don't know, your Archfiend's Vessel naturally leaves the graveyard. Lurrus lets you cast these things from the graveyard. It's going to trigger to make a zombie. You can play Scavenging Ooze and eat your own graveyard to make zombies. So there's plenty of shenanigans there. Maybe the most exciting way to play in Historic is with some cards that are really good at coming in and out of your graveyard, like Narcomoeba, Silver Smoke Ghoul. We played this Dredge deck a while ago in Historic, and it was actually really sweet. You just like super aggressively self-mill, hit your Narcomoebas, hit your Silver Smokes, maybe some Arc-like Phoenixes, some Crippling Chills, and then all of a sudden you're getting back this massive board. Well, if you throw Aglor into the mix, Narcomoeba's like insane. Narcomoeba goes to your graveyard, then it goes to the battlefield, plus Aglor is going to give you a zombie. So every Narcomoeba you mill is essentially adding 2 bodies and 3 power to the battlefield. Every Silver Smoke Ghoul that you mill is going to come back as long as you gain some life, which your deck would be designed to do with like Crippling Chill or whatever. And then that's going to come along with a 2/2 zombie kicker, which is kind of insane. And then maybe your board gets Wrath or whatever, and then your stuff goes back into the graveyard, or you chump with it in combat, like your Silver Smoke Ghoul, it goes back into the graveyard. Well, then you can get it back again, and you're getting a zombie. You're not getting the stacking of the perpetually ability, because remember, it only triggers when the creature goes from your library or your hand into your graveyard. So if you get back a Silver Smoke and then it dies, it's going from your battlefield to the graveyard, which isn't giving you another Aglor trigger, but even just one trigger with these cards looping in and out of your graveyard is going to be really, really powerful and hard to beat. So Aglor, I think this card's actually really strong. I think there are sweet Alchemy decks we can build around it, and I think it even has a decent amount of Historic potential. Next on our list, we have Sinister Reflections, a weird duplicating spell. So 2 blue mana, instant speed, conjure a duplicate of each of up to 2 target non-token creatures you control to your hand. So essentially, Sinister Reflections is a 2 mana divination that requires you to have creatures on the battlefield, and the cards that you're drawing are the creatures that you're targeting. So let's say you play a Shambling Ghast, you play an Eye Twitch, you Sinister Reflections, essentially you get a Shambling Ghast and an Eye Twitch into your hand. You're going to have to spend mana to recast them, but still, you're essentially drawing 2 cards for 2 mana and instant speed. There is some risk here. If your creature dies to a removal spell in response, you won't obviously get the copy of it because it would fizzle part of Sinister Reflections, but still, I feel like that's kind of an interesting ability in the right shell. Maybe you play this in like a spirit deck or something. Imagine stacking up lords. I think that's really powerful. You play a Patrician Geist, you copy your Patrician Geist, you copy your Skyclave Apparition, you cast him again the next turn, maybe some sort of blue-white Tempo Taxis style shell, like reusing your adversaries or whatever, could be really strong. In Historic, maybe it could be a Arc-like Phoenix style card. It's kind of hilarious if you can like discard some Phoenixes, get them back. Your Sinister Reflections is a cheap spell that can help you get back your Phoenixes, and then you get another copy of a Phoenix and a copy of a Sprite Dragon or whatever. And remember, the creatures that you conjure, these duplicates, they're real creatures. So if you get a duplicate of an Arclight Phoenix, it's fair game to discard it to Faithless Looting and get it back from your graveyard for free rather than trying to cast it. It's not like some weird token copy that's going to go away if it hits your graveyard or something. I could maybe see like Merfolk using it as a way to get more to lords. So it's going to be interesting. I feel like there's certainly risk with Sinister Reflections, and it is expensive. That's the biggest downside. I feel like you really got to use this with cheap creatures, because remember, you got to actually spend the mana on these cards. If you're copying huge expensive things, yeah, that's great, but you still got to have the mana to recast them. And when you consider something like Glasspool Mimic or Mirror Image, for 1 more mana just straight up gives you a copy, no extra mana required, Sinister Reflections loses a little bit of its luster. But in some sort of aggro spell mana style deck, where you can embrace the fact that this is an instant, where you got cheap threats that you can easily deploy to the battlefield, maybe flash threats, maybe cheap lords that you can copy and just make your board really, really huge, that's where I think Sinister Reflections could really shine. So certainly an interesting card. We've never really seen anything like this before, so kind of hard to evaluate. I think it's got a chance to be good, but only in really specific decks. Next up, we have one of my favorite cards from Alchemy, Tireless Angler, also maybe one of the funniest cards from Alchemy. 3 mana 1/4 Human Rogue. When an island enters the battlefield under your control, draft a card from its spellbook. So, like we've seen with other cards with this draft from a spellbook mechanic, there's 50 cards in the spellbook. You get 3 options. You choose one of them, put it in your hand. So essentially, it's island fall, draw a card, but the card you're drawing is from its spellbook, so just how good it's going to be depends on how good the spellbook is. And we'll get there in a minute. I want to start off by saying, this kind of looks like a playable card. If you compare it to like Tireless Tracker, 3 mana, landfall, make a clue. So you get a clue and then you get to pay 2 to sack it to draw a card. It does grow the Tireless Tracker, but still, Tireless Angler, there's no hoops to jump through. You don't got to pay 2 mana to sacrifice a clue. It's just play an island, draw a card, which is one of the cards from its spellbook. So it kind of compares to 3 mana like Titova or AC, which are pretty powerful cards. So I could see this card being pretty playable. The question is, how good are the cards in the spellbook? And the answer is, it really depends on the cards you get from the spellbook. So it has everything from Ruin Crab, which is probably essentially useless. I guess it's a chump blocker in most decks, up to things that can actually close out the game. Serpent of Yawning Depths, or Fleet Swallower, Spine Megalodon, and everything in between. And the part that cracks me up about this card is this poor guy goes out and go fishing and can end up with a Fleet Swallower, a Spine Megalodon, things that are literally bigger than entire ships on the end of his hook. I don't know how that actually works out, but I think the card is, I don't know. Like, is it worth it to tutor up these cards? Play an island, draw one of these cards. I guess, like, it's not bad. Is it better than a random card from your deck? Maybe not in most cases, but still, it is repeatable card advantage. I like that it's a good blocker. Against aggro decks in Alchemy, mono white, mono green, random malevolent hermit style decks, a 1/4 for 3 actually locks down the ground pretty well, and it can do the same thing in some matchups against aggro in Historic, against the human decks, various aggro collected company decks, even against Mayhem Devil decks. Like, a 1/4 does stop a lot. My concern with the card is it only triggers on islands. And when you think about this, you're like, okay, I jam this in something like Is It Dragons? Or some Grixis control deck. I just play this, I play lands, I draw a card, sure, they're random fish. Maybe that's not super powerful, but still, it's going to be powerful enough. It's still generating card advantage. The thing is, in a world where, in Alchemy, you got a bunch of, like, pathways, you got the new lands that we got from our Return to Innistrad, how many actual islands are you going to have in your deck? Maybe you got to be some sort of, like, mono blue deck. Maybe you can build mono blue fish control, where you just play Tireless Angler, and then try to counter everything your opponent does, bounce everything your opponent does, and use the fish that it catches to close out the game. So, I don't know, the fact that it only triggers on islands makes me a little nervous. Not because it's not powerful enough, just because it limits the number of homes that it can go in, but I think the Tireless Angler, even though it's only fishing and getting fish, and that's what you're drawing with its ability, has potential to be pretty good as like this weird Tireless Trackers type card for Alchemy and Historic. We also got Unexpected Conversion, one of the weirder cards we've seen in a long time. 3 mana sorcery, draw 2 cards. Then you can exile an instant or sorcery card from your hand. If you do, search your library for any number of cards with the same name and exile them. Then shuffle, seek an instant or sorcery card for each card exiled from your hand this way. So Unexpected Conversion, it's essentially a divination that more or less allows you to Lost Legacy an instant or sorcery from your own hand. So divination, not really playable anymore. Sorcery speed, draw 2 for 3, not really good enough for constructed formats. So is the upside of Lost Legacying insert sorcery from your hand going to make this worth it? I don't think so. What do you do with this? The best I could come up with is you're like playing some sort of control deck and you got Unexpected Conversion. You run into another control deck, and you got Doomskars in your deck. Maybe you're playing Historic and you got Day of Judgments or Wrath of Gods or whatever. These wraths that are essentially going to be dead in the control mirror. So you're like, all right, I Unexpected Conversion, I draw 2, I exile the Doomskar from my hand, I get rid of all the copies from my deck, so hashtag deck thinning, and then I know I'm not going to draw them the rest of the game, and hopefully I, draw an extra card or 2 from the ones I exiled from my hand. Is that enough value to make this playable? It's like this weird cycling that hopefully gets a dead card out of your hand, or maybe it goes the other way. You're playing against a aggro deck, and you're like, oh, I really need to draw a Doomskar. I can Unexpected Conversion, exile the Seagate Restoration that there's no way I'm ever going to get to cast against this aggro deck anyway, and this increases my odds of drawing Doomskar. Like, I exiled some dead cards, makes it more likely to draw the live cards. Is that enough of an upside to make this card playable? I lean towards no. I thought for a minute, maybe there could be like a combo with Dragon's Approach where you're like, okay, I fill my deck with Dragon's Approach, I Unexpected Conversion, I exile all the Dragon's Approaches, and draw a bunch of cards, but it only draws for the cards in your hand, remember? So it doesn't draw for the ones you exile from your deck, but still, I guess you could play a million Dragon's Approaches and then have one finisher on your deck. Use this to exile the Dragon's Approaches and get closer to drawing the finisher, which maybe there's some weird combo potential. So I think where I am with this card right now is it's designed to be a best of one card. In best of three, I don't think you need this card. You got a sideboard. In best of one, maybe it does work as the way to get rid of your wrath against control decks, or get rid of some expensive instant or sorcery that you don't really need to help you find your wrath against aggro decks. So maybe it's a best of one thing. I don't know. If you play best of one, let me know in the comments. Is this a card that's exciting to you? Is somehow Lost Legacying yourself the new hotness in Historic and Alchemy? Let me know what you think in the comments. We also got a new giant wizard, Rime Wall Protector, 3 mana, 3/4 with Ward 1. When it enters the battlefield, each other giant or wizard you control, and each giant and wizard card in your hand perpetually gains Ward 1. So I'm excited about this card for one reason. Wizards, I don't think want this. Wizards are about being aggressive and casting spells, but giants, I think, is where this card could shine. I've wanted giants to work in Standard ever since they were printed a year ago. I've been waiting and waiting and waiting for giants to work. They haven't been good enough. One of the reasons, maybe the biggest reason that giants haven't been good enough, is their curve is really high. The good giants are 4 mana, 5 mana. They're so expensive. You don't have any 2 mana giants, and you don't really even have many 3 mana giants. You got Aglor, which is okay, but it's legendary. You got Satyr Skull Charger, which isn't really what you want in a giant deck. You want things that are sitting on the battlefield blocking, not stuff that's, sneaking in for an attack and bouncing back to your hand. Satyr Skull Charger is kind of a 5-drop actually in a giant deck most of the time. Rime Wall Protector, even though this card isn't super busted, it just fills out a really important part on the curve for the giant deck, and it does do something like protecting your giants a little bit. That's perfectly fine. That's a nice little bonus. So is this enough to make giants tier 1? Almost certainly not. Is it enough to make giants a little bit competitive so you can actually win some games on the ladder? It might be, because we're starting from a low base here. Giants are pretty far down in the meta rankings, but I do think that Rime Wall Protector is a really solid 3-drop option that fills in an important part of the curve and definitely will show up in giant decks, in Alchemy, and if by some miracle they take off in Historic, probably there as well. Moving on to the red cards, we got a bunch of spicy ones, starting with Conductive Current. Conductive Current, 3 red mana, 3 damage to each creature. Choose an instant or sorcery card in your hand. It perpetually gains. If this spell would deal non-combat damage to a permanent or a player, it deals that much plus 2 instead. So Conductive Current, it's kind of a twist on Anger of the Gods or a Sweltering Suns, where you get 3 damage to everything for 3 mana. A drawback is it is triple red, which is kind of asking a lot. And then you add a shock to an instant or sorcery spell in your hand. It has to be one that already deals damage for it to really work, so you can add it to like a counter spell or something. But you can power up another burn spell that you have in your hand. You can power up additional copies of Conductive Current. The first one deals 3 damage to everything, and then you can target it, the second copy, with the first one, and then when you cast the second one, it's going to be plus 2 damage, so essentially you turn an Anger of the Gods into a burn down the house. The second copy will be 5 damage to everything. So how good is Conductive Current? And this is a card that I think is most interesting in Alchemy. In Alchemy, we don't really have a 3 mana 3 damage sweeper. We got a bunch of 3 mana 2 damage sweepers, or with some sort of twist, Vampire's Vengeance, Crush the Weak, Cinderclasm. We don't have something that's just 3 damage to everything for 3 mana. So I think that by itself is a bit exciting. The question is, where do you play this? When you think about the kind of decks that would want this, it would be like Grixis Leer, maybe Izzet Goldspan. But in those decks, the triple red cost is a concern. Like, that is a drawback. If you're playing a 3-color deck, even a 2-color deck, are you going to have red, red, red over the first 3 turns of the game to cast this on time? Or is this going to be a 3-drop that you're casting on turn 4, turn 5, turn 6 because of mana considerations? It might not seem like much, but the difference between 1 generic and 2 red and 3 red is really, really big in decks that are playing multiple colors. So I think maybe that limits some of this card's home. That said, we've seen like some of these mono red mid-range style decks, mono red dragons, mono red control show up in Standard standard a little bit. I could see this really being good there in Alchemy, where it doesn't kill your Smoldering Eggs, or your Maniform Hellkites, or your Moonveil Regents, or whatever big finishers you're playing. This is just a hard sweep to your opponent's board, and you probably got some random damage-based removal spell that's chilling in your hand that you can power up and kill bigger things thanks to Conductive Current, or worst case, power up the second copy in case you need to kill bigger things in the future. So I think that's the main home. In Historic, I think it loses even more of its appeal, because you have literal Anger of the Gods, you have literal Sweltering Suds, and most of the decks that would want this effect, as we were talking about before, are 2 colors, 3 colors, where 1 generic and 2 red is just so much quicker, so much easier to cast than triple red. I don't think the upside of adding a couple of damage to an instant or sorcery burn spell in your hand is going to be enough to make up for the mana cost, and the fact that Sweltering Suns and Anger of the Gods, they have upside as well, like exiling everything. That's big against like Cauldron Familiar decks. Sweltering Suns, you can cycle it away. So I don't really see much of its historic potential. I think that's doubly true because if you think about the burn aspect, like it's cute that you cast this and then you power up a shock to 4 damage for 1 mana. That's kind of insane, or whatever random burn spell. But if you think about a burn deck is probably playing a bunch of like cheap 1-drop creatures that would be getting got by your Conductive Current, and you don't really want to wrath your own board to add a damage to your bird spell. So burn decks don't typically play sweepers like this because it's killing their own creatures. So I feel like Conductive Current is a cool design. I think it's got a lot of potential in standard, well, Alchemy, I guess, if you can make the mana work. The triple red still scares me. In Historic, I don't think the upside's enough, especially when you consider the drawback of the triple red mana cost to let it beat out things like Anger of the Gods. We also got Brittle Blast. Brittle Blast, 3 mana instant. Creatures and planeswalkers your opponents control perpetually gain. If this permanent would die, exile it instead. Brittle Blast deals 5 damage to target creature or planeswalker. So Brittle Blast, it's essentially a twist on Soulseer. In Soulseer, it's not a bad card. 3 mana instant speed, 5 damage to a creature or planeswalker. Perfectly fine. We've seen these cards show up in the past. The upside of Brittle Blast is it can really wreck certain decks and archetypes by giving all of your opponent's stuff. If it would die, it gets exiled instead. In a lot of matchups, that won't really matter, but in some matchups, that's going to matter a ton, both in Alchemy and in Historic. So if you're playing Historic, this is hitting on like Lurrus, it's shutting down Cauldron Familiars, it's shutting down Arclight Phoenixes. That's a really big deal, and I don't know if it's efficient enough in Historic to show up in the main deck, but I could certainly see this being a key sideboard card where you can snipe a relatively big creature and incidentally wreck a Lurrus deck, a Cauldron Familiar deck, whatever recursive creature style deck you might be up against. As far as Alchemy is concerned, I mean, we got recursive things there too. Like, this answers an Old Growth Troll forever because it's going to get exiled. This deals with Shambling Gas and Eye Twitch and Blood on the Snow recurring things. And in Standard, I've definitely played my fair share of Soulseers. Just 3 mana, 5 damage to something. That's kind of an effect that's pretty close to being playable. When you consider that kind of the next options up are like Demon Bolt, Thundering Rebuke. Sure, Brittle Blast is like 1 more mana than Thundering Rebuke, or Demon Bolt got Foretells, so whatever, it's kind of a weird twist on things. So it's 1 more mana, let's say, but you get the upside of additional damage and the exiling mode. This might make it worth it just to play over a Thundering Rebuke in your Alchemy deck or your Demon Bolt in your Alchemy deck. So Brittle Blast, I mean, it's just a random little uncommon, but I actually think the card is pretty relevant, at least as a sideboard sniper for decks that have recursive things looking to go in and out of the graveyard, where this can deal with an entire board full of things with the help of some additional removal spells. Next up, we got Arms Scavenger, another draft from a spellbook card. So 2 mana 2/2 Human Warrior. At the beginning of your upkeep, draft a card from Arms Scavenger spellbook, then exile it. Until end of turn, you can play this card. So essentially, this is kind of a red twist on draft from the spellbook. Every single turn, you get to draw an extra card. Well, it's going to be a card from the spellbook, but you gotta use it that turn or lose it. So what kind of cards are you drafting with Arms Scavenger? And the answer is a bunch of cheap equipment. So if you look at the list of cards you can actually get, it is all 1 or 2 mana equipment. And really, outside of maybe Colossus Hammer, these aren't especially powerful cards. They're not, there's no swords, there's no batter skulls, there's nothing like that. These are just cheap equipment, which I think means Arm Scavenger is going to be a card for decks that just care about having equipment on the battlefield, period. If you think about it, once this gets going, you play it on turn 2, on turn 3, you untap, you get to draft one of these cards, you can play it you're going to be getting an equipment on the battlefield each and every turn, assuming you have the mana. Sure, it might not be a super powerful equipment, but if your deck just cares about equipment, period, this is going to give you a lot of equipment. The thing I love about Armed Scavenger most is it is the right tribe for equipment decks in our new Alchemy format. If you think about the equipment deck in Alchemy, it's warriors. Warriors have this huge theme of equipment. You got Krolls and Core Blade Masters for double strike, and Akiris and Bwainers and Nahiris, even Resolute Strike to equip that Colossus Hammer for free. Armed Scavenger, it seems perfect for this deck. And this is another deck, and this is one of the things that makes me excited about this Alchemy set. It's a deck that just hasn't been good enough. We've played it fun, casually, budget, but it's never really been a competitive deck in Standard. Armed Scavenger is a boost of power. It's powering up an archetype that could use the help, and I don't think it's going to break this archetype. I don't think that because of Armed Scavenger, suddenly Boros equipment, Boros Warrior equipment is like a top tier deck, but I do think it gets more playable, and Armed Scavenger is perfect for it because remember, cards like Core Blade Master, Akiri, Bwainer, they don't care what equipment you have on them. It's not about the quality of the equipment, it's just that it is equipped with something. Like, if you can equip something, Kroll protects it, Core Blade Master gives it double strike, Akiri can draw you cards and all that kind of stuff. So I think the Armed Scavenger, absolutely perfect for equipment warriors. I think it's still probably a tier 3 deck, but Armed Scavenger seems like a really fun addition just to make sure that you can be having the equipment on the battlefield necessary to make your deck function. So I don't think this one's really designed for historic, but in Alchemy, I think this is a really sweet card for Boros equipment warriors. Next up, we have our first planeswalker from Alchemy in Tibalt, Wicked Tormentor. So Tibalt, 5 mana, 3 loyalty, +1, number 1, at double red, draft a card from its spellbook, exile it, and you can cast it this turn. So we've seen this before with other red cards. It seems like this is a red way to draft from a spellbook, kind of the impulse draw, where you get it for 1 turn only. Second +1, this ability hurts my brain. It deals 3 damage to target creature or planeswalker, unless its controller has Tibalt deal 3 damage to them. If they do have it deal 3 damage to them, you can discard a card. If you do, you can draw a card. So essentially a horrible Punisher removal mechanic where you're going to target the thing that you want to die. If your opponent has life, they're going to be like, no, I'll take the 3. And then your reward is you get to rummage if they do that. I think that ability is actually like not very good. And then -X, make X 1/1 red devil creature tokens. With when this creature dies, deal 1 damage to any target. So Tibalt, good news and bad news. As far as how competitive it'll be, let's start with the bad news. Bad news is 5 mana, a little bit steep for a planeswalker. 3 loyalty, not very much. So a lot of mana, a little loyalty. The good news is it does have a lot of what you're looking for in a planeswalker. The +1, making mana and potentially generating temporary card advantage reminds me of like the 2 best modes on Chandra Torch of Defiance. The mana making +1 mode, and also the take up to draw a card, you gotta cast it this turn, impulse type draw. Of course, you're getting the impulse draw from its spellbook, but still, +1's generating card advantage and a +1 that ramps is actually very, very powerful, and it works really well together, which we'll talk about in a minute. You can +1, use that mana to cast something that you find from the spellbook. Second +1, I think you just pretend like that ability doesn't exist. I guess it gets good if your opponent's low on life and can't take the 3, but really, I think you're using the first +1, and then the -X. And -X, it's a way to defend Tibalt. You can tick down maybe -1, -2, make a couple devils to jump block. And speaking of protecting Tibalt, which is really important with planeswalkers, the reason I'm actually kind of hyped about this being a competitive card is that first +1 in the spellbook. If you look at its spellbook, we broke it down into 2 parts here. They're all devils or devil-related cards, but almost half of the cards in the spellbook, 6 of the 15, but many of the cards in the spellbook, 6 of the 15, are cards that you can cast immediately using the red mana you generate from Tibalt. And that's another way to protect Tibalt. You can play Tibalt, 3 loyalty, +1, make 2 mana, get a card from its spellbook. Hopefully, you'll have a 40% chance of hitting one of these cards. If you hit one of these cards, you can immediately cast it and use it as defense and have your Tibalt up to 4 loyalty. I guess Devil's Play doesn't really count. I mean, you could use it as removal and kill something maybe. But the rest of them, at least you can tick up, play it, and chump block is a worst case scenario. Then we have some more powerful cards, but they're cards that you can't cast right away. If you tap out for Tibalt on turn 5 in uptick, you're not going to have the mana to play Sin Prodder or Hell Rider or Charmbreaker Devils, although these are some of the most powerful devil creatures that we have access to in Magic. Hell Rider, great with the Devil token. Sin Prodder generates card advantage. If you get a bunch of spells, Charmbreaker Devil could be very good. So that is the spellbook of the +1. The other +1, I don't even know. It's like the worst lightning bolt of all time. I don't even know how to consider that ability. And then the -X, I think it's sneaky powerful when you consider that like Devil's Playground is 6 mana to make 4 of the same Devil tokens that Tibalt makes, or Burn Down the House is 5 mana and makes 3 of them. Like Tibalt is the same Devil making power. Like worst case, you can play Tibalt immediately -3 and get 3 of those Devils, which according to other cards is probably worth pretty close to Tibalt's mana cost, who would probably be 5 mana, maybe 4 mana if we were really lucky to get that card just as like a random sorcery. So I think the Devil making ability is probably going to be a little bit underrated. I really like planeswalkers that have +1s that generate card advantage. They have a pretty good track record of being at least standard playable. Tibalt, sure, it's got the twist, the Chandra-esque twist where you got to use the card this turn, but it gives you the mana to cast it. But we've seen Chandras, we've seen Rouse, we've seen Nicole Bolas be very good cards in standard, and Tibalt's mono red, which is an upside. You don't have any of these crazy mana costs, so that's a good starting place for a planeswalker as well. The question is, where does this actually fit? Where do you play this? Are you playing this in like Alrund's Epiphany decks in Alchemy? You're playing mono red mid-range decks in Historic with Chandra? Like, what is a home for this card? I think maybe an interesting home could be some sort of sack deck. Some of the Devils that you can find from the spellbook work with sacrifice synergies. Plus, worst case, you can always just sacrifice them for value, and then the Devils are great sacrifice fodder. So maybe like Mayhem Devil decks in Historic, Lolth decks in Standard. I also think a sneaky home for this is ramp decks. We focus mostly on the +1 double red mana generation as being a way to cast cards from the spellbook, which it often will be, but I also think you could use this to ramp into an Ugin or an Ulamog, like turn 5 Tibalt, untap, land drop, uptick, 8 mana, Ugin. That's a pretty powerful line, and we've seen like these mono red planeswalker decks actually sort of be a thing in Historic, so maybe Tibalt could have a home there as well. So Tibalt, it's weird, it's wonky. 2 of its abilities seem pretty strong. The middle one seems really bad, but I think this card has got a shot. It does a lot of what you want with a planeswalker, taking up for loyalty while generating card advantage, having potentially multiple homes, and defending itself either with its spellbook or with the Devils. So even though it's a weird card, I think it's got a chance to be playable somewhere. The question is, where? Next up, we got Blood Rage Alpha, a new wolf. So 4 mana, 4/3 wolf. When it enters the battlefield, choose one. Either another wolf or werewolf you control fights a creature you don't control, or when you cast your next wolf or werewolf spell, it gains, when it enters the battlefield, fight up to 1 target creature you don't control. So Blood Rage Alpha, the part that makes it digital only is the fact that its second ability doesn't last for a turn. It says when you cast your next wolf or werewolf spell, so in theory, you could cast this and then 5 turns later cast your next wolf or werewolf, and you're still going to get the ability. I think this card is relatively powerful. It reminds me a little bit of like Wicked Wolf with a twist. Maybe, oh boy, I hate to make this comparison, but like a really bad Flame Tongue Kavu that requires fighting. But these 4 mana removal style creatures, if you got a big wolf or werewolf on the battlefield, it just comes down, makes it fight, snipe something. If you don't, well, then you can store up that removal for later. I think if this is going to have a home, it's going to be in the werewolf deck in Alchemy, and I think it might have a shot. One of the weaker spots on the werewolf curve is actually the 4-drop slot. You got Arlen, which hasn't really taken off as much as I was hoping. Ill-Tempered Loner, one of my personal favorites, but again, hasn't become a staple. Howlback Piper can be explosive, but its front side's pretty small, so it's fighting for a weak spot on the werewolf curve, which might mean in Alchemy, Blood Rage Alpha is just like the best option available, at least in some number. Plus, werewolves have some pretty big bodies, so you take advantage of the fight ability and follow this up with Tovolar's Huntmaster or something. The other reason to be high on this is Azeka's Chariot's getting the nerf in Alchemy, and if you look at current standard werewolf decks, the real 4-drop is Azeka's Chariot. Even though it doesn't have any synergy in the deck, it's not a werewolf werewolf. Werewolves aren't about tokens. It's just a really push standalone card. And I mean, I guess that's a good argument for nerfing it, that your werewolf tribal deck is playing this very off-tribe cat vehicle just because it's so good on its own. So now that Azeka's Zeeka's Chariot is much less powerful, only making 1 cat rather than making 2 cats, I kind of feel like a Zeeka's Chariot is going to be on the downswing in Alchemy, which probably opens the door for something like Blood Rage Alpha to take over the 4-drop slot in the werewolf deck. So we'll have to see. Maybe it ends up being Arlen, maybe it ends up being something else, but with a Zeeka's Chariot getting the nerf, Blood Rage Alpha could be a very good 4-drop for werewolves. We also got Frenzied Geist Blaster, 2-mana 2/2 human wizard with prowess. When it enters the battlefield, if there are 20 or more instants or sorcery cards among cards in your graveyard, hand, and library, you can discard a card. If you do, seek an instant or sorcery. So this card, it just seems pretty solid. We've seen Heartfire Emulator, just a 2/2 prowess for 2 with the upside of maybe being removal. That's a card that is seen play in Standard, even a little in Historic. Fissure Wizard isn't very good, but it kind of has that card draw ability where it ETBs, discard a card, draw a card. Frenzy's Geist Blaster does that, but on steroids. ETB in a deck with a bunch of spells, discard a card to draw an instant or sorcery essentially from your deck. So you're not going to get a random land. You know that you're going to be hitting a spell, which you theoretically want. Reminds me a little bit of Abbot of Carol Keep with its ability to be a 2-drop with a powerful prowess ability that also can not really generate card advantage, but a way to filter through your deck. So there's a lot of reasons to think Frenzy's Geist Blaster could be good, even more so when you consider how many potential homes it has. If you look at Standard decks, which Alchemy decks should be pretty similar, something like Is It Dragons easily has enough spells to make this work. You hit that 20 spell mark with no problem. So is this going to beat out some of the other cards like Smoldering Egg? I don't know, but it certainly could. We have Lear decks. They have more than enough spells. Plus, the synergy is really sweet with Lear because Lear kind of wants cards in your graveyard. So you can Geist Blaster, discard an instant or sorcery, you get another instant or sorcery, and you're filling your graveyard for Lear in the future. Delver decks seem like a really obvious home. The Burn deck we played with Thermo Alchemist, this seems absolutely insane there. You're able to discard extra land and hopefully seek up a burn spell because you do have some control. You can play 20 burn spells in your deck or 24 burn spells, and you know that Frenzied Geist Blaster is going to be discard a land, get a burn spell if that's what you want. It can be discard a land, get a counter spell if you play 20 counter spells in your deck, which is probably too much, but you know what I'm saying. There is a bit of control here. You control what instants or sorceries in your deck, and I think that's better than a random draw in this scenario. Once you get back to Historic, there's even more options. This seems really good with Arclight Phoenix. I mean, you have a ton of spells, so you hit that mark naturally in your Phoenix decks. You can discard a Phoenix, tutor up a spell that you can cast to get back your Phoenix. That's a lot of inherent synergy. We got Dreadhorde Arcanist decks, also want cards in the graveyard, so you can flash them back with Arcanist. We got Faithless Looting, great card to discard. We got Delver Style Shell, so I think Frenzy Geist Blaster, it's just a really good card on rate. 2-mana 2/2 with prowess, solid. The ETB of being able to discard a card to draw a card, or actually even better than draw a card, seek an instant or sorcery, also very solid. A little bit limited in the shells that it can fit in because you do need a lot of spells in your deck, and that's something to keep in mind. If you're only playing 10 spells, this card's pretty bad, but if you're playing a prowess 2-drop, you probably got a lot of spells in your deck anyway, and this card has a lot of potential. So I think this one will probably show up in Alchemy and also a decent amount in Historic. We also got Fearsome Whelp, a new dragon uncommon, 2-mana 1/1 dragon, and is flying. At the beginning of your end step, each dragon card in your hand perpetually gains. This spell costs 1 less to cast. So the more turns this sticks out, the more of a discount you're going to get on your dragons. Downside is it's a 2-mana 1/1. Even with flying, that's not a very strong creature. Its ability is kind of like, well, very similar to the +1 on Sarkhan. You don't get the color fixing, but you get the same cost reduction. We haven't really seen Sarkhan take off for the most part, but I think that Fearsome Whelp in the right deck can be really strong. You got to be a deck with a lot of dragons, because remember, this only impacts the cards that are currently in your hand while this is on the battlefield. So I think you got to be like a Tiamat deck, or maybe mono red dragons. Where this isn't going to work is like Is It Dragons in Standard. I know we call it Is It Dragons, but when you have, you know, a few gold spans, and gold spans getting the nerf anyway, so it's probably not going to be as good in Alchemy. But if you just have, you know, 4 dragons and some smoldering eggs and a bunch of spells, this isn't going to be good enough. But if you're playing a deck that has a ton of dragons in it, 10 dragons, 20 dragons, then Fearsome Whelp seems like a legitimate ramp card. Like, imagine playing this on turn 2 in a Tiamat deck. You play this on turn 2, you go to your end step, Tiamat suddenly goes down to 6 mana. Then you have it survive a turn. Next turn, it goes down to 5 mana. You can untap and just turn 5 a Tiamat, get a whole bunch more dragons, and then those dragons are all going to be getting the discount from the fearsome whelp. So I think that in the right shell, this has a lot of power, but it doesn't slot into any current top tier deck because, as we were talking about, you don't have enough dragons in the Is It Dragons deck, which is really an Alrund's Epiphany deck, and Epiphany's getting nerfed anyway. So fearsome whelp, if you're playing like a dragon brawl deck, or if you build a Tiamat deck in Alchemy or an Historic, it's going to be great. Just keep in mind, you gotta have a lot of dragons for it to work. We also got Town Razor Tyrant, a 4-mana 4/4 dragon with flying. When it enters a battlefield, target lane you don't control loses all abilities except for mana abilities and gains at the beginning of your upkeep. This permanent deals 2 damage to you unless you sacrifice it. So almost land destruction, slow land destruction. Eventually your opponent's going to get low enough on life, they're going to have to sacrifice the land. So how good is Town Razor Tyrant? And wow, the challenge is there's a ton of competition, even just in Alchemy. In the 4-drop dragon slot, you got Leyline Tyrant, another 4-mana 4/4 dragon. You got Mana Form Hellkite, a 4-mana 4/4 dragon. You got Moonveil Rage, a 4-mana 4/4 dragon. If you go back to Historic, add in Thunderbreak Rage and in Varric's Bladewing, there's a ton of different options fighting for the same slot, all doing slightly different things. Town Razor Tyrant does have some upside though. Like, it does do something right away. It comes in right away and snipes a creature land in Alchemy. That's probably the biggest upside. You target a Faceless Haven, suddenly it just adds mana, or a Hall of the Storm Giants, or a Lair of the Hydra. The creature text isn't going to be there anymore, plus it's going to start taxing your opponent's life. They're going to be taking 2 damage, or you get rid of the land and that's a win anyway. Like, a 4-mana 4/4 ETB destroy a land with flying, that's kind of a really powerful card in Standard. This isn't quite that, but it has close to that. Once you get back to Historic, you get some additional options. You get the creature lands, there's also castles, there's the flip lands like Search for His Contest, so there are some good targets for Town Razor Tyrant. Maybe this could bring with it some sort of land destruction deck in Historic. We got Goblin Rune Blaster, we got Stone Rain, so we're slowly getting closer, although remember, Town Razor doesn't actually just blow up the land, at least not immediately. Maybe the best home for this is at the top end of some sort of aggro deck. The more you can pressure your opponent, the more likely this is to be blow up the land with its ETB, because your opponent's not going to be able to afford to keep it around at 2 damage a turn if you are really pressuring their life total. So maybe this is a Reckless Stormseeker card in Alchemy, where you're playing just red mid-range, Gruul mid-range, Rakdos mid-range, whatever. You play your Stormseeker, you follow up with this, you tax the land, you smash your opponent, they probably got to sack it because they can't afford to take the damage, and then that's a really strong card. Or maybe even like mono red aggro or mono red mid-range is Historic. So I think there are a lot of possibilities for Town Razor Tyrant. On the other hand, there are some matchups where it's not going to be that good. It is a little bit matchup dependent. If you're playing against a very aggressive deck like mono white in Alchemy, or mono green in Alchemy, or humans in Historic, this loses a bit of its value. I mean, sure, it's a 4-mana 4/4, but your opponent's probably going to be like, okay, sure, hit my land. Either I have enough lands and I don't care, I'll just sacrifice it, whatever, I'm playing all 1-drops and 2-drops anyway, so no big deal. Or they're going to be like, I'm pressuring your life total so much that I can afford to take damage for a few turns, 2 a turn, whatever, I'm just going to kill you with my stuff. So keep that in mind. It's at its best against slower decks, the mid-range decks, the Lulf decks, the control decks with Epiphanies or Teferis or whatever. That's where Town Razor Tyrant is really going to shine. So Town Razor Tyrant, I like this card. It's not quite land destruction, but it's pretty close. It comes on a good body. Just be warned, there's a lot of competition in this slot. There's a lot of these 4-mana 4/4 dragons. Can Town Razor Tyrant beat out all those other options? Gonna have to wait and see. Anyway, that brings us to the end of our daily Alchemy spoilers for today. So what do you think? What are you most excited about from today? What decks are you going to be building with these new cards? What do you think? Are you warming up to the format at all? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching. I hope you all enjoyed it. And I'll be back tomorrow with more daily Alchemy spoilers. So until then, everyone, have an amazing day. And I will talk to you soon.